Hey everybody, welcome back to Cinematically Late, the series dedicated to talking about movies that I may have missed for whatever reason, whether they were in theaters or I just never got around to seeing them. Today we're talking about a movie that I not only saw, but actually just recently rewatched because I've been in a kind of a big Spider-Man phase, and that's Spider-Man Homecoming starring Tom Holland. And although this wasn't the first time we saw Spider-Man in the MCU, that was in Captain America Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming is the first collaborative movie between Sony and Marvel to introduce Spider-Man into the MCU as his own sort of standalone character with his own set of movies. Now this one being the very first one is titled Homecoming because it's essentially Spider-Man coming home, more or less, back to Marvel after having a long hiatus with Sony primarily, now it's sort of in negotiations back and forth, split between Marvel and Sony. And since this is the third iteration of Spider-Man in live action that we've ever seen, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what happens, so let's just go ahead and get right into it with the first thing that I want to talk about, which is the new Spider-Man himself, Tom Holland. Now, I feel like this is probably the best version of Peter Parker and Spider-Man that we have ever seen. I feel like Tobey Maguire did a really good job in nailing who Peter Parker was as a character. I feel like Andrew Garfield really nailed who Spider-Man was as a character. But Tom Holland does this really good job of melding the two worlds and sort of putting his own little spin on it, being very comic accurate, a lot of fun, very quippy, very much like the Spider-Man that we all know and love from the comic books. And he does the perfect version of that by just sort of being himself because he very much embodies this character because it's just who he is. And I feel like that's what makes him probably the best Spider-Man, at least in my opinion. You can have a fight down in the comment section down below, but I feel like he is the best overall live-action Spider-Man that we've had to date. And as I mentioned before, this was Spider-Man's sort of introduction, his big solo run in the MCU. And I like that a lot because they gave him the opportunity to be able to be his own character despite us already having the preconceived notion of one trilogy and one set of sequel movies, which was the original live action ones. And so this was the MCU introduction to him. And I feel like they didn't have to spend too much time on who Spider-Man is because we very well know who Spider-Man is, especially after having 5 movies, 2 different live action actors over the past about 20 years. And now this is the 3rd version. So we already know his story. A lot of people know Spider-Man. They know his background already, so we don't really need to keep harping on that. This one just sort of jumps right into the MCU version of that, which I liked a lot. I liked that the fact that they decided to skip all of that stuff we've seen before. We don't need to see the death of Uncle Ben again. We don't need to see a lot of those things. We already know the spider bite happens, how he gets his abilities. They just jump right into it and say, this is our version in the MCU, this is what's going on with him, this is how he's dealing with the Avengers, dealing with how to be a superhero. Those things are what works for Spider-Man, is how he's struggling, this duality of being a normal person and being Spider-Man, this hero. So this very much captivates that. Now, point number 3 that I'm going to make kind of is the double-edged sword to this, where Spider-Man is a little too invested in the MCU. Now, when I say that, you're probably thinking, but you just are about to negate everything you just said. Not really. When I say that he's a little too invested in the MCU, by that I mean there's a little too much Iron Man, there's a little bit too much connection. There are some nice connections with, say, for example, Captain America, as well as Bruce Banner in this movie. Just little tiny nods, like a little video playing or picture in the background. But Iron Man is very front and center. And I'm not the biggest Iron Man fan in the world, so I feel like it's a little bit overdone. I want Spider-Man to be Spider-Man, not so heavily rely on a father figure type character. We already know that Peter Parker had Uncle Ben, and I feel like that's kind of the model they should have gone with, is that he looks up to Uncle Ben and what he stood for and what he's taught Peter. That works great. But when you start integrating into the chaotic person that Tony Stark is and the things that's going to bring to the character, although it does bring certain advancements like his suit and a bunch of other fun stuff that Peter Parker doesn't have to necessarily figure out by himself, it kind of takes away from the character. It makes him very heavily reliant on other characters. And Spider-Man's just such a good character by himself, there's no need to make Iron Man such a big portion of his life. Is it important that he's there and that he can provide certain things and certain advantages to the character of Spider-Man? Absolutely. But I don't necessarily think that they should be using him as a crutch as heavily as they do in this movie. And the last thing that I really want to talk about in Spider-Man Homecoming is the villain. It's one that we've never seen before by an actor that we very well know, especially in the comic book world, and that's Michael Keaton playing Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture. Now, obviously, this is a very updated version of the Vulture. It's not like we know from the comics, but that sort of integration of MCU worked very well for this particular character. Plus, it's Michael Keaton. I mean, the guy's Batman. He's played characters like Birdman and other like big name characters, and we know that he's really good at it. We very much trust Michael Keaton. He's even coming back for Batman, for crying out loud. But I feel like he does such a good job for a character that we've never seen before. We pull for this character. We want this character to do good and be able to have all of the things that he's having provide for his family. I love the connections with the actual MCU, with the villain, both with Spider-Man and with Iron Man. That's amazing. They did a really good, thoughtful, deep dive into that. It felt like a character that could be real and plausible in the sort of grand scheme of what the MCU is. Much more low level, but most certainly one of the best villains the MCU has ever seen. Not only done by a great actor, but having a great story to tell that's actually interesting. It's not like he wants to take over the world. He actually wants to provide for his family, and that's not something that I can knock him for. I feel like it's very reputable and actually something that's I can pull for this villain, which is something you want from a character like this. So I have to give kudos to the writers for creating a villain that we actually care about, and I think he might rank among the top villains, at least in the MCU for me. Alright, so those are pretty much all of my thoughts that I have for Spider-Man Homecoming. Everything that I want to talk about. I know this movie's been out for a while. It's been probably done to death, but I figured it's something that I haven't really touched upon. And next week, aka 5 minutes from now when I record the sequel one, Spider-Man Far From Home, which you can check out next week. There's some other thoughts that I have there, but I really wanted to talk about it because I'm in a big Spider-Man kick, and it just is that time. I just never got really a chance to talk about these movies. But there's been a lot said about them already, so I don't want to bore you to death with that stuff. But if you did like this video, make sure you leave a thumbs up, as well as go down in that comment section down below and let me know if you liked this video. While you're down there, make sure you hit the subscribe button, as you do not want to miss out on Cinematically Late every single Thursday. As I mentioned, spoiler alert, next week is Spider-Man Far From Home, and other Cinematically Lates that I've done, as well as join me live every single Sunday, or at least I try to go live every Sunday, around 7 p.m. Eastern. Come talk shop, nerdy stuff, hang out for just a little while, and just have some fun. So I hope to see you guys there. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the next one.